Go to the next slide. So for our equity statement and land acknowledgement, as members of this community, mutual respect, cooperation, and understanding are our goals. We shall neither condone nor tolerate behavior that undermines the dignity or self-esteem of any individual or create an intimidating, hostile, or offensive environment. It is our collective responsibility to create a space that is inclusive and welcomes discussion. Any form of discrimination and harassment will not be tolerated. Hate speech rooted in, but not limited to, excuse me, Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, sexist, racist, classist, ableist, homophobic, or transphobic sentiments and or remarks will not be tolerated. We all have an obligation to ensure that an open and inclusive space free of hate is established. Any behavior that does not demonstrate an understanding of these principles and or create an unsafe atmosphere will not be accepted. We can never work to end systematic and institutional violence if we do not center the narratives of Indigenous peoples in our collective design making for justice, social justice, and equity. As settlers in Turtle Island, we directly benefit from the colonization and genocide of the Indigenous people of this land. In order to engage in resistance and solidarity against the injustice inflicted on the Indigenous people, it is imperative we constantly engage in acts of decolonization. Toronto is in the dish with one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. You can go to the next slide. So what is the Newcomer Students Association? We are grassroots membership-driven organization dedicated to supporting and empowering newcomer, immigrant, and refugee students in their cultural transitioning, social and economic integration, and civic engagement in Ontario post-secondary institutions, as well as the broader society. We do this through community engagement, capacity building, and a diverse set of initiatives focused on enhancing students' leadership development, social capital, and sense of well-being, of belonging. We provide gender-specific programs for professional development opportunities targeting newcomer, immigrant, and refugee women, as we recognize that these women face multiple intersecting settlement and integration barriers. Our work is driven and guided by the voices of our community and is highly influenced and shaped by our team's own lived experience as newcomer, immigrants, and refugees. You can go to the next slide. So be sure to tag us and use the hashtag ending the silence if you're posting to social media, which we encourage you to do. So this is our at. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at newstudents.ca. To the next slide. So for the code of conduct, please be friendly and welcoming. No harassment of any sort will be tolerated. You will be immediately and permanently removed from the session if you are in violation of this rule. No photos and/or audio recordings. NSA will be recording the session in its entirety. However, you can feel free to keep your video and microphone off so to not be recorded. We kindly ask that you do not take any photo or video recordings of yourself. Be mindful of how much space you are taking up, whose voice are we hearing, whose voice aren't we hearing, who are you lifting up, and take care of your body and mind. Every 20 minutes, make sure you take at least 20 seconds to look at something 20 feet away to rest your eyes. Take this time to stretch as well. Take care of your mind as well. Should you need a break or find something traumatic and need support, there's a trained social worker on our team who can join you in our breakout room. Just message me privately or one of the hosts and we will arrange for you for that to happen. For using Zoom, you can go to the next slide, please. So we're going to be using Zoom as we all are right now. And here's a little overview of some of this functionality. At the bottom, you will see a little mute and a video icon. And so the host will unmute all participants, and we will unmute those who will be asking questions during the Q&A period. We would also ask that your cameras and your microphone do be turned off, and just let the speaker who's speaking. That way, there's no distractions. For the next slide. We encourage you to also use a chat function to chat with your fellow attendees. Please keep in mind of our code on conduct, and any violations will result in immediate removal. So at the bottom of the screen, you will see a little chat box, and you can just click that button, and you will see chats that are happening, and you can also type in the chat at any point in time. You can go to the next slide. During the Q&A period, feel free to put your questions on the chat or use raise your hand function to ask a question. The chat will be monitored by our team, but due to time limitations, we might not get to all of your comments or questions. If you have an updated version of Zoom, your raise of hand function might be in your reaction section on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Go to the next slide. We recommend speaker view for presentations, which is in the top right-hand corner, but please choose whatever you're most comfortable with. And here, I'm just going to pass it over to Elka, who will be speaking next. Thank you.
Thank you, Ladies. A very warm welcome to all of you who have joined us today. I welcome you on behalf of OCASI and NSA this evening. And as you are all aware, this is the second session in our series of three panel discussions. And this one the topic is responsive community supports and resources for gender-based violence. We have three speakers this evening, and I'm going to introduce them as they begin, like one by one, so that I'll introduce the first speaker, and then that speaker will speak, and then as we finish that, I will just kind of move on to the next person. And after all three speakers are done, then the Q&A, which I will be moderating. So feel free to put your questions on the chat whenever, as something occurs to you and you want to put them in the chat box. And during the Q&A, if somebody would like to speak and ask their question themselves, we welcome that very much. So make sure you just raise your hand or make, get that, just get that attention so that we can do that. And if you would prefer just to put the question on the chat, that's perfectly fine as well. So also we will be putting the feedback survey in the chat, the link to that. So whenever, like later on, once the session is done, we would appreciate if you can fill that out. It will also be emailed to you later on. So no great pressure on that one. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to just introduce the first speaker and welcome her. So the first speaker is Dr. Mujgan Rabari Javoko, and she is an academic scholar with interdisciplinary expertise in social and public policy and administration, and with a specialization in immigration and settlement, race and ethnicity studies, and equity, diversity and inclusion issues. She has 18 plus years of post-secondary teaching and applied research experience in Canada and in England. She has been an adjunct instructor at Ryerson University since 2013. She is a passionate advocate for application of intersectional lens of analysis in understanding diversity, equity, and social justice issues in Canada. Mojan advocates for the elimination of systemic and institutional inequalities, and she champions the labor market integration of internationally skilled immigrants and civic engagement and representation of marginalized groups in Canada. over to you, Dr. Javoko, if you can take the floor now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you for the lovely introduction. I am just going to start this slideshow. I've prepared a slide presentation for today. So, so just to go through it, as part of the introduction, I want to give an overview of understanding. There's so much of a misconception with regards to what domestic violence is or what gender-based violence is. And it's really intricate because it involves multiple factors. So trying to define it is very challenging. And some of the hidden side effect or implications of domestic violence is what makes defining it quite problematic. So I'm going to start by defining it. The main aspects of it is in any situation when an individual is experiencing any level of power or control, that is domestic violence. Essentially, it boils down to power and control element that is involved in domestic violence. And it manifests itself, this wheel ends up sort of showing all of the multiple factors that could potentially contribute to how power and control is manifested within any dynamic of relationship. It could be with family members as well as your intimate partner, obviously. Most of the cases is with intimate partner, but yet you do end up having domestic violence that ends up or gender-based violence that ends up happening in other contexts as well, other relationships as well. So just to go around the wheel, spiritual abuse, anything religion or culture being used as a means of controlling and having a power dynamic with an individual, that's what comprises of spiritual abuse. There's cultural abuse, any aspects of culture or gender dynamic or patriarchy or cultural practices being used as a means of controlling, empowering an individual is problematic as well, is what is considered as domestic violence. Immigration status. In a lot of situations, women are actually dependent within the application processing, immigration application processing. So as a result of it, with the male being the main applicant, that causes some power dynamic within that relationship as well. Not filing for citizenship, not filing correctly documentations could be problematic in this sense. Coercion and threat, any form of coercion or threat with weapon, which is the most obvious one, but also just threatening to impact a family member, children, pets, just threatening personal harm, harm to property, harm financially, harm emotionally, all of that is considered under coercion and threats. Intimidation, any form of intimidation. Emotional abuse. Now, this is quite a loaded area to the point that actually within our legal and family law system and child services, emotional abuse is not understood well. Practitioners involved appreciate it a lot and have a deep understanding of what it involves, but trying to have any sort of approval, systemic approval of what emotional abuse is and what individuals are actually experiencing in these kind of dynamic has been quite challenging, because there's no physical other than anecdotal sort of communication about it. There's no evidence, so it's hard to actually prove evidence of it. So emotional abuse, yes.
Sorry to interrupt. Are we supposed to see some slides? Because we're
yes, you're not seeing it? Oh my gosh.
No.
Okay, pardon me. I thought I was screen sharing. 1 second. Why is this happening? Oh my gosh. I am so sorry.
The presentation is very interesting. We don't see the screens.
I am so sorry. Here we go. Nah, thank you, Sarah, for interjecting. There we go. Here's the slide.
Okay,
are we seeing it now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, perfect. I'm so sorry, everyone. I was supposed to have set it up and I just forgot how to do it. Pardon me. Isolation, any form of isolation, just to carry on going around the wheel. Isolation is another form of violence. Minimizing, denying, or blaming the individual is also is part of the emotional abuse, but obviously is slightly different from, is more of an overt swearing. Is part of minimizing as well, belittling. Using children and reproduction, and what we here mean by reproduction is denying the woman the right to choose to whether they want to have a family, have a child or not. Any form of dominance, as I said, or control of the individuals is considered. And economic abuse is sort of another stages of domestic violence. So as you can see, is the issue of power and control in many different ways. And it ends up influencing many different sides or aspects of a relationship in that. And the wheel has been taken from YWCA, so if anybody wants to have the reference, it's right there as well. Now, in terms of breaking down, I'm wanting to give you a bit more of a background into sort of emotional sides of it. There's abuse of anger, threatening words or behavior, undermining, accusing and blaming, forgetting to do things, even passive aggressive way of exercising misogyny or patriarchy sometimes ends up being a way that male abusers end up exercising domestic violence. Name calling, judging, criticizing, it just goes on and on in terms of emotional and verbal abuse. Now, the COVID has brought with it a whole host of other related ways that domestic violence could be exercised as well, such as misinformation about the pandemic, denying access to appropriate medical attention, for example, taking car keys or not allowing a person to be able to take themselves or their children for medical appointments. Talking or isolating children from mothers, mothers from children, or other family members because of symptoms of infection, withholding necessary items such as hand sanitizer, cleaning products. As you can see, it just keeps on going on and on in terms of the various ways that you can end up influencing. It essentially involves any form of power or control being exercised that ends up impacting women's health or access to health and safety measures under the pandemic has become an issue. So adding on to pre-existing preconditions that women and families were already experiencing. Now, another misconception is who are the victims of domestic violence? We always think that is racialized, socioeconomically challenged, naive, or passive individuals that end up experiencing domestic violence. And what is surprising is the reverse of that, is actually the strength of the woman that sometimes ends up attracting an abuser to them. And some of the strength could be kindness of their characters, putting other people's needs first, sticking to hard situation, or being faithful, trustworthy, woman of integrity, being generous, being empathetic, having empathy, being forgiving, believing in people's potential. So although they're experiencing abuse, they still believe that they can actually, through love and through attention or through their skills, they would be able to change the person. And sadly, abusers are abusers, and there never is a behavioral choice and a behavioral learning that they've gone through, and is who they are. And therefore, to be able to actually change that personality once they've chosen you as being the subject of where they're going to be directing their abuse. Generally, evidence has shown that that dynamic does not change. The power dynamic just does not change. There's no way of being able, there's a whole host of programs that individuals are sent to, but the outcome of it is, unless the person ends up recognizing, the abuser ends up recognizing their abuse, their personality doesn't change and their abusive behavior doesn't change. Now, who are the abusers? Narcissistic individuals are generally the type of individuals that are inclined to be susceptible of being having or displaying abusive behavior. Nothing is their fault. Is their way or the highway, whatever you want, they want the opposite of it. They're always the victim. Somehow the situation always turns around and you're the one, as a person that is being abused, that is the blame is put on. And no matter what you end up doing in these kind of situations or dealing with a person like this, is very difficult to actually stop the abuse as well. The only way of stopping the abuse is leaving, and also leaving the marriage and leaving the dynamic or the relationship does not mean an end. For some individuals, if you end up having a family, if you end up having children, that abuse carries on beyond. It goes through, you end up experiencing it all through your legal battle for child custody and child access. And beyond that, since you share a child, most likely the way our legal system, family law system works, the fathers should, to a certain extent, have access to the children, and they do end up having access, quite a liberal access to children. And as a result of it, the co-parenting situation constantly puts women at risk of domestic violence, or in a situation that they're constantly experiencing. So being able to manage that dynamic or gaining some sort of a control over the situation is quite important in this context. And eventually, most women figure out how to be able to manage the situation on their own. Now, I thought it would be very useful to talk about what is healthy relationship, what is unhealthy, and what is abusive relationship as well. And this table ends up very clearly outlining that. So healthy relationship involves respectful communication, trusting, being honest, being treated equally. Unhealthy relationship is a lack of communication, disrespectful behavior, not trusting, dishonesty, unequal, any aspect of unequal dynamic within a relationship. And abusive is where mistreatment ends up happening, accusation ends up happening, controlling behavior, isolating behavior, and, you know, at its worst, physical abuse occurs. So it's very important to pay attention to that dynamic. And also, your abuser, or in an abusive relationship and situation, the person doesn't start with punching your face out. It doesn't occur like that. It's progressive. You basically, because of the fact that the individual is not narcissistic, they have to actually condition you to be in a situation that you're accepting of their behavior, you're accepting of the situation. And often it takes a while, because when it happens in an intimate relationship, it takes a while to realize, it takes a while to respond, it takes a while to realize that you need to take control of this power dynamic, and this is an unhealthy relationship. And generally what ends up happening in such dynamic is there's a cycle to abuse as well, which also perpetuates it for it to take a long time for one to realize and get themselves out of the situation as well. It starts with a situation happens, it starts with a tension builds, a trigger, something ends up triggering a situation, then there is a abusive occasion or occurrence that ends up happening. Then there's excuse, apology, there's a honeymoon stage where everything is really good and the person ends up being really responsive, very kind, very involved, apologizes for everything, and then again you're back to the routine of the tension being built up, trigger, and abuse. And you tend to go through that cycle. I read in one of the reports saying that it takes the woman at least up to 7 years to leave an abusive partner in an intimate relationship. And for females that are able to actually get out of the situation earlier than that is heads up to them for them having been able to, and it takes a woman up to 7 times effort of leaving before they actually leave permanently for good. And there's various factors that ends up contributing to that. Some of the complexity of it is the financial implications of it. If the children are involved, you know, again, finances, housing, women's work not paying, pay equality also ends up playing a role in this dynamic as well. And societal treatment of or inequalities that women end up experiencing also tends to be a barrier here. Now, in terms of when you leave, what are some of the stages of grief that you go and emotional sort of processes that you go through as well? As any loss, you end up going through the complete loss process, with you know, the first stage being shock and denial, not believing that you're actually in that situation. And this sometimes ends up actually happening prior to leaving. You're actually questioning, I cannot deal with this. The pressure has gotten to the point that something needs to be done. Then is anger and frustration, as in like, why is it this way? Why me? How am I going to deal with this? Embarrassment, shame, all of that. And obviously cultural background also, and the societal dynamic plays a part in how you end up responding to this situation. Depression and detachment, dialogue and bargaining is when you end up trying to seek ways of being able to find a solution. You end up reaching out for services, trying to resolve, help, assist, change the individual that you're with. Then is acceptance. And this is actually a warning sign when you get to the point that you're actually accepting that I cannot change another person. And the reality of it is you cannot, nobody can change another grown, mature individual being, even children. They end up having a learned behavior by such an age, and you can't change that as well. Then once the individual leaves, then there's a whole host of issues that they would have to deal with. But at the least of it, they end up having some level of empowerment, some level of security, some level of gain of self-esteem and meaning in life as well, because they're separated from this power dynamic. Now, Statistic Canada has done quite a few research, as well as some of the agencies in the sector. And I'm going to go through some of the highlights of those research. For one thing, Statistic Canada has highlighted that social isolation, loss of employment, and reduced income are some of the major factors that increases the risk of domestic violence and stress within families in general, stress in individuals in general. And then there's other stressors that we're experiencing with the pandemic, which is the lockdown, being confined with families in smaller spaces. If you live in the city of Toronto, the way the housing is right now, closure of schools, childcare facilities, elderly care facilities, increase of tension at home because of having multiple families within the household 24/7. Accessing help has also become challenging during the COVID, with a lot of services going online, and a lot of services being closed or having limited capacity has also limited and put a pressure in terms of experiences of domestic violence. So in terms of the increase, so far the statistic, and obviously more research needs to be done in this area, the expectation is 20 to 30% increase has happened to domestic violence. And the crisis calls in some regions has been as high as 400% what it used to be. So that's a significant increase when you think about in terms of implications of COVID pandemic on domestic violence. I've already talked about the risk factors. Now, another report that I found that was really detailed and very well done, the Ending Violence Association of Canada and ANOVA has done a comprehensive research. And in their research, they ended up studying 376 staff and volunteers from domestic violence sectors ended up responding to this survey. And they highlighted some factors that I'm going to go through. 46% ended up highlighting the prevalence of severity of violence. So they ended up noting that prevalence and also severity of the violence has increased. 82% ended up describing increase in the nature of the violence, the type of violence that they were seeing happening. 34% talked about mental health and well-being. And 20% talked about tactics that was used to commit violence and control had changed and was concerning. Now, what are some of the challenges survivors are experiencing in receiving services? Fear or discomfort with COVID pandemic and some of the controlling measures that has been put in place in terms of accessing services, but also what their abusers also, the measures that their abusers also putting on them as well. Survivors' inability to be able to participate in phone or virtual support environments as well because of lack of technology or internet. Also lack of privacy in order to be able to do that. Discomfort for receiving services that was normally provided face-to-face as well. And being directly prevented from being able to seek any sort of services. Now, in terms of needs, what the survivors that ended up accessing services, what they were asking for was predominantly in terms of, as you can see, 79% needed food. So economic aspects of it had a major implications on survivors. Psychosocial mental health and well-being was the second, and access to technology, since all of the services has gone online. So having access to technology, crisis counseling, then rent, advocacy, emergency shelter, childcare, and the list goes on. So there's quite a few factors that. Now, in terms of the question that was asked, have you observed changes in the type of challenges survivors are sharing with you since the emergency order? And they talked about, the survivors talked about abuse directed at children, technology used to control them, isolate them, and track them, abuse witnessed by children and youth because of the fact that they're spending a lot of time at home, escalation of severity of the abuse and violence, escalation in frequency of abuse, and access exchange at site to visit with shared children being closed. So for parents that were in the situation that were going in public spaces or control the spaces for exchange of child in terms of child custody access, having limited places to go. Again, I'm gonna, being vigilant of time, I put quite a bit of a detail of the research, but the report is provided, and I can provide the link to anybody that is interested, or if you make a note of the Ending the Violence Canada report, you would be able to get some of the data. So I'm just gonna skip through a few of the slides that I've included due to interest of time. So some of the changes that was introduced as a result of, in services that was introduced as a result of COVID, was technology-mediated services and resources being provided. For example, hand signals and code numbers and words were exchanged between individuals in terms of being able to signal that they need help or they're seeking help. Deleting records online, partnership with essential services. support provided within essential services, such as like grocery stores, pharmacies, and as you were using those services, some of the women were using some of the codes and signals to be able to communicate the violence. Housing, shelter, and transportation was another area, and legal and justice system. A lot of the legal and justice system, actually not a lot, all of it ended up going online. So the emergency, there was delays as a result of it as well. And some of the conferences and legal proceeding, family law proceeding had to be done by online. I believe my time must be up. I'm getting some messages here, I believe.
Yes, yes, it would be good if you can wrap up. Thank you.
Wrap up? Okay, I'm just going to wrap up right now. Sorry. I just ended up. Now, what is needed in terms of services? So what the pandemic has highlighted: poverty reduction, any measures towards poverty reduction, any measures towards housing, obviously, unequal access to technology and internet, precarious, low-paying employment that females generally end up being in is a factor, and lack of universal childcare. So addressing childcare could potentially mean a lot to females that are experiencing domestic violence, to the victims of domestic violence or survivors of domestic violence. Needs of women with disability needs to be considered, and some of the vulnerabilities that they end up experiencing. Needs of Black, Indigenous, and racialized women. Non-status immigrant refugees and newcomer women, because their challenges is slightly different. Trans, non-binary, and gender diverse people, and also sex workers and all of the other traditionally marginalized inequalities, groups that experience inequalities. Now, I want to end with this, with some of the existing gap that exists right now, which the pandemic ended up highlighting. Limited focus on pandemic's impact on technology facilitated sort of services that is being provided, and also the building the capacity already beyond COVID to be able to provide some services online and have a framework for providing those services online is important. No focus on the impact of pandemic on GBV prevention work, including training and education. So as we know, the sector could benefit from better training and education towards how to manage domestic violence or gender-based violence as well. Limited focus on the distinct impact of the pandemic on sexualized violence and domestic violence, particularly, or intimate partner violence. Limited knowledge about engagement with survivors, and also how to better involve survivors within the process of educating and in the work towards addressing and minimizing domestic violence. And I'm going to end right there and take questions when it's time to do so. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mojgan, for a very detailed, exhaustive kind of, highlighting of all the various, factors, challenges, needs, including the impact of the pandemic, and also initiatives, support that is needed, and the gaps. So one of the things that really stands out for me is the complexity that you started with, and the inability oftentimes of the person, of the woman in the relationship mostly, or the fact that it's already a bit late by the time she often realizes what's going on, because it is a relationship of intimacy, of love, and so there's a lot of blurring of boundaries that can happen within that. And there's the culture piece as well. What is your expectation from your partner? Sometimes there's a gap in what expectations immigrants before they move to Canada, what they have, and then once you move here. So all the pressures of, the transition, the migration transition itself also exacerbates all these issues. So of course, very heavy topic, but as we all know, thank you for taking us through the whole cycle, and very informative. Thank you.
Thank you, Alka. Thank you, everyone.
So I'm going to request our second speaker, Sidra Ahmed Chan, to join us now for the presentation. Let me introduce her for a moment. She is a public educator, researcher, and writer who focuses on the topics of gendered violence, migrant justice, and Islamophobia. Sidra is the author of the Rivers of Hope Toolkit, and we can put the link on the chat to this toolkit as well, a community-based resource for survivors of Islamophobic violence. Her work has been profiled by the Toronto Star, CBC, Omni Television, Global News, CTV's The Social, Muslim Girl, and BBC World Radio. Her writing has appeared in the Toronto Star, TVO, CBC Docs, and Broadview. Sidra is pursuing her PhD in adult education and community development and women in gender studies at the University of Toronto. I welcome you, Sidra, to join us.
Thank you so much. What an honor to be here with all of you this evening, taking time out of your evening to stay online, be on Zoom, to talk about a difficult issue on a Friday evening, gender-based violence. And thank you, Sarah, and all for organizing this and for inviting me. I love the hashtag ending the silence. That's a huge passion of mine. That's why I speak and try to write on these topics, because I know for me, for a long time, all of these topics were taboo. Wasn't allowed to talk about them or think about them or speak out. So it's always an honor to have an opportunity like this. Before I start sharing the slides, actually, I want to share a video with you all. And, I guess I'll give you a little warning. It's disturbing. There's nothing visual in terms of seeing violence. Okay. So nothing like that. But this video is a public service announcement to raise awareness about domestic violence. And it features the voice of a woman who, in this case, is calling the police asking for help. But I want to share this because I feel like this video this public service announcement really illustrates how that issue of silence and breaking the silence. And, when we think about resources and how we can connect people living with gender-based violence with support, a message I want to give to everyone who's here, at this webinar today is that you're all resources. Everyone is a resource and a potential to be someone who will be able to read between the lines, who will be able to hear if someone's asking for help, and who will know how to connect that person with help. So in showing you this video, it's not to say, you should call the police, because in some cases, if someone doesn't have immigration status in Canada or for other reasons, it can be complicated and to think through whether it's the time to call police or not. But the reason I'm showing you this phone call is it's about learning to listen, and it's about learning to see what might be going on in friends, families, community members around us. So with that introduction, I'm going to share this video with you. And, throughout this whole webinar, if you ever need to take a break, I think, there's a social worker here as well who will be able to meet in breakout rooms. So, all right. Hopefully this works okay, the internet, sharing a video. So here we go.
Operator 901, where's the emergency?
127 Brynmere.
Okay, what's going on there?
I'd like to order a pizza for delivery.
Ma'am, you've reached 911. This is an emergency line.
Large with half pepperoni, half mushrooms.
You've called 911. This is an emergency line.
How long it'll be?
Okay, ma'am, is everything okay over there? Do you have an emergency or not?
Yes.
And you're unable to talk because...
Right.
Is there someone in the room with you? Just say yes or no.
Yes.
Okay, it looks like I have an officer about a mile from your location. Are there any weapons in your house?
No.
Can you stay on the phone with me?
No. See you soon. Thank you.
So that video, that recording is actually a recording of a real 911 call, where there was someone who was obviously in a situation of a dangerous situation where the person who was doing the abuse was there, right? And so often, in different courses and trainings that I do with service providers, one thing that's a very simple practice, but can be a very important intervention. If you're ever supporting people and it's a couple or a whole family there together, are there opportunities for people to speak to someone alone, right? And the previous presenters gave a really good insight into, one of the new challenges with COVID is that there are new barriers for people to be able to communicate and reach out for help in a way that they aren't monitored. But I know the presenter after me is going to share some solutions and some ideas that have come up to get around that barrier. But so that phone call really highlights, are we listening? Do we know what to listen for? And are we prepared to ask or to offer help if someone we know is affected by gender-based violence of any kind, whether it's violence from an intimate partner, a family member, a boss, a coworker, a sibling? Are we ready to listen, and do we know how to offer help? And, it can feel really intimidating if someone reaches out, or if you know someone living with gender-based violence of any kind. And, not all of it is going to be the signs that you see or the little hints that you hear dropped. It's not always going to be something as drastic as what we just saw in the public service announcement. It could be things like someone saying, oh, I gotta make sure he knows where I am. He freaks out. He gets really jealous, right? He gets really jealous if I'm talking to someone else. I have to send him a photo proving where I am because he doesn't believe me, right? These sort of little hints that, wow, is someone in a controlling relationship? Or if you have a good friend who tells you things and asks you, do you think this is okay? Do you think this is normal? Maybe it's a family member, a relative, where you've seen things like this. But regardless of what our connection is to situations of gender-based violence, it's important to know, off the top of our head, or even in advance, what support resources there are available. I usually leave these at the end of a presentation, but I thought, why not share it at the beginning? Take a screenshot. There'll be a recording of this whole presentation. I could also later on in the Q&A drop all of the links in the chat just so you have them, because it's really great to have these resources before we get a phone call or before we find out about a situation, because then that way we're not looking for them when we're panicked. We kind of already know the landscape of what kind of help is available. So there's 2 slides of support resources I have. This first slide, it shares a website called Shelter Safe. And this one provides a Canada-wide map of shelters and transition houses. It's really user-friendly. So if if someone is looking for a shelter, that's a great place to start. The previous presenter also referred to some resources from Ending Violence Association of Canada. This website here is a really great resource, again, Canada-wide support resources, sexual assault centers, right? If you know someone who's been through sexual assault, there are specialized services that can support them, right? There's whole centers dedicated to supporting survivors of sexual assault. There are crisis lines and support services. They may need health services, other services. You can absolutely find out where those are. There are lots in Toronto, but wherever you are, you can, in Canada, you can find the resource there from Ending Violence Association of Canada. They also provide a Canada-wide list of shelters, transition houses, and support services, and different organizations and resources that could be relevant. And honestly, you know, being someone who does the that kind of homework and supports someone, you know, making phone calls, looking up websites, looking up, you know, what's the eligibility? Do they have a waiting list? Are there openings, right? That kind of work is very helpful to do for someone, because if someone's just been through a situation of violence, or if they're living with violence, those kind of tasks can really feel very overwhelming. So as a friend, as a support, as a resource, you can really take that on. And I'm seeing that there's some great resources being put in the chat now that are much more based in Toronto. These are Canada-wide, and then there's some great resources that are based in Toronto in the chat as well. Another support resource is a crisis support / national suicide prevention. This is kind of, I mean, everything we're talking about today is heavy, but it's important to mention this. If you're supporting someone who's been through gender-based violence, been through sexual assault, been through childhood sexual abuse, these are really traumatic things. And sometimes in coping with that and facing all of that, someone might struggle with feelings of self-harm or suicide, because in a way, it's like all of the hurt gets turned inwards. And so if you're supporting someone and they're dealing with that as well as dealing with the aftermath of violence, this is a really great resource for that. They have qualified crisis support, people who they really know how to deal with situations that are a crisis and where self-harm is involved. Phone number, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, right? Good thing to be aware of. And, you know, with these things, for me, I think, you know, it's good for me to be aware of it, and hopefully I never have to use it. But that way, if I know someone who's in the situation in the moment, I'm not like, oh, now what do I do? And like, you know, Googling, and like, I already have everything. I'm ready to be a resource. 211 is really great too, because they have a whole wealth of information on community-based health and social services. They offer specialized supports for newcomers. They're available by phone and chat. Wow, some really great resources coming through in the chat as well. My Plan app, wonderful. And then we have the Assaulted Women's Helpline in Ontario, which is amazing. 24 hours, 7 days a week assistance in English in up to 200 different languages, right? So thinking about how to support someone, this is a really good place to start, because basically whoever reaches out to the Assaulted Women's Helpline, you're going to get a counselor who's going to speak with you about what's going on, what do we do next, right? And it's not a place that you just would call once. Like, they say, hey, call back if you need to, you know, like they're there as an ongoing support. And they can also connect someone to local services as well, like whether it's a hospital-based program, counseling services, legal services. That's what they're there to do. So if you know someone who's been through violence, Assaulted Women's Helpline, really good first step. And this is really good too. I mean, I guess, you know, people always say if it's an emergency, like a life-threatening situation, to call the police. But, you know, for people who don't have immigration status, that can be complicated, because they might be afraid that calling the police, and there's a valid fear there, calling the police means, you know, activating investigation into their immigration status, risk of deportation. Calling the Assaulted Women's Helpline, it's not an emergency response service. I'm not saying it replaces that, but it is an option that doesn't have that risk attached to it, because the counselors on the phone, they're not going to be asking about immigration status or anything like that. But maybe the discussion about police and the complication around involving police is something we can all talk about in the Q&A. And then before I move on, just a few more just to kind of put on your radar. Kids Help Phone, really great resource if there are situations involving children, child abuse. Great thing to always share with kids. If you're working with youth and children, why not share this resource with them, right? Maybe they don't want to tell you if something's going on, but at least they have a phone number, and that's a starting place, right? There are support services for male survivors of sexual abuse as well. Like often men get left out of that conversation if they can be victims. And so there's a 24-hour multilingual toll-free phone line, right? For male survivors of sexual abuse. There's the Trans Lifeline, which is staffed by transgender people, for transgender people. And there's also the NISA helpline, which is a peer-to-peer faith-based counseling line available to Muslim women of all ages. So these, and then also the amazing resources being put in the chat, these are really great things to have somewhere, you know, maybe make a Google Doc and just, you know, save it in your computer, you know, write it out, print it out, post it somewhere, just so you have it on hand, so you're ready to be a resource if someone reaches out to you. So this is usually what I share at the end of the presentation. So put it at the beginning, because I want it to really, everyone to really take all of that away with you today, something concrete. The previous presenter shared about, you know, gender-based violence and some of the different dynamics in there. I just want to give a big, like a zoomed out picture. You know, when talking about gender-based violence in newcomer communities, it's always good to remember that gender-based violence is a universal, unfortunately, problem. It happens across the globe and in Canada. It's a public health problem, and it's a violation of human rights. So some statistics on gender-based violence in Canada are shown here, and as well as one statistic that's gives a picture of the global scale of the problem. So about 1 in 3 women worldwide have experienced either physical or sexual violence in their lifetime. 1 in 3 across the globe. So that, you know, shows how gender-based violence, you know, unfortunately, it's almost like it's not normal, it's never normal, but it's almost become part of like a normal way of life for you know, how women and girls experience life. That's how common it is. In the Canadian context, gender-based violence is a crisis. It's a crisis. It's a daily crisis that, you know, that's why, again, I love the hashtag ending the silence, because it's a daily crisis that people don't speak about, right? So you can see here, about once a week, a woman is killed by her male partner in Canada, every week. On a single day in 2019, so this is the last time they gathered this data from across the country, over 1,800 women and 1,500 children were staying in shelters or transition houses. And then the last statistic is about femicide. So the times where women or girls are killed as a result of gender-based violence. So that's not just intimate partner violence, but any kind of gender-based violence. A woman or girl is killed every other day in Canada as a result of gender-based violence. Every other day. So ending the silence is very important, because, as I said, this isn't normal, right? This isn't normal. It isn't okay. But we're kind of almost trained to see it as something that's, oh, well, that just happens. No, right? There are reasons it happens, and there's ways to stop it. And that's why we're all here today. The other big picture information I wanted to give is, you know, is that most gender-based violence looks like men's violence against women. And this isn't to negate the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, men and boys absolutely can be victims of abuse, including childhood sexual abuse, other forms of trauma, physical violence, psychological abuse, that can all happen to men and boys. Don't get me wrong. And also gender-based violence can happen in same-sex relationships. So, two women married to each other, if one of them is abusive to the other, that's absolutely, intimate partner violence. It's dangerous, it's wrong, right? And there's no male perpetrator in that case. So those that does happen. Those are realities, and we need to talk about that as well. But the reason I share this overarching theme is that sometimes people, I guess, get it twisted, thinking that, with abuse, it's happened in both directions. Who knows who's more at fault? Men abuse women, women abuse men, and it's just who knows what's going on, right? Like I've really heard that a lot in different workshops and stuff that I've done. So I think it's really important to share these statistics that the majority of gender-based violence and the majority of severe gender-based violence is about men abusing women. Women in Canada are more likely than men to experience gender-based violence. According to 2008 police reported data, women accounted for almost 8 in 10 victims of intimate partner violence. Women also accounted for close to 8 in 10 victims of intimate partner homicides committed in 2018 in Canada. So that means someone being killed in the context of their relationship. 8 out of 10 victims are women being killed by men. And then in terms of sexual assault, that gendered pattern is really there. 87% of police reported sexual assault victims were women or girls. So I just think it's really important to keep sight of this, because that's where, this being an issue of justice and about the lives of women and girls and having freedom to live without abuse, to live without these kinds of statistics. Gender-based violence, in a strange way, isn't about what it seems. So if, in a case of physical violence, it may seem like, okay, maybe he's angry, he has some physical aggression he wants to get out, he's angry, that's why he's being physically abusive. No. All gender-based violence is about power and control. So physical violence is in a way, the tool. It's the tool, but the goal, as you see in this diagram, is power and control. So all of these different forms of violence are tactics that you might see, right? When you're thinking about, okay, gender-based violence, is this affecting anyone I know? What does it look like? It could look like financial abuse. What's the goal of financial abuse? Power and control over the person being targeted for abuse. The tool being used there is controlling access to money. So if someone isn't able to access their own paycheck, or if they aren't allowed to have their own bank account, you might wonder, okay, is someone controlling their access to money as a way to keep power and control over them? Another form of violence, immigration status related abuse. That still, it's all about power and control. But the tool that someone will use, they'll say, oh, I'll report you if you don't, stay with me, right? I'll get your status taken away somehow if you don't stay with me or if you don't do what I say. So again, the goal is power and control. The tool that they're using, immigration status, fear of deportation. And you can see that for all of these. Spiritual abuse. The goal, power and control. The tool, the tactic, oh, God says it's okay that I abuse you, or, just something like that, right? So in a way, it's like the violence seems like it's about one thing, but actually the goal is something else. The goal is about power and control. And so that's a really, really important thing to keep in mind, because it'll help us think about, okay, is this person being controlled in some way, right? Is someone threatening them or using something? Almost like, you know, you see puppet strings, right? Is someone using something as a puppet string for them? Are they shaming them, saying, oh, you know, you're going to bring shame to the family if you talk about this abuse, so you keep quiet? That's a puppet string, right? And so that's a very important thing to know, because, you know, one of the biggest lies out there is that, you know, gender-based violence, abuse, oh, it's just because he's angry, it's just because he's stressed. No way. Like, it's because he's trying to get power and control. And yeah, has anyone, can I just see a show of hands? Has anyone ever heard the idea that gender-based violence or abuse happens? Like, you could put a thumbs up in your reaction, or raise your hand or something, or type in the chat yes or something. If you've heard that abuse is just because they're angry, they're stressed, they lost, you know, he's angry, he's stressed, that's why. Okay, yeah, right? It's anger, it's stress. I'm seeing some thumbs up. Yeah. I don't want to swear, but that is BS, okay? Because it's not true. Like, because here's the giveaway. Here's the way you can tell that that's completely not true. Why is this person who's so angry and stressed that they can't control themselves and they just have to be abusive, why don't they do that at work? Why does that all go away if their boss shows up? Why does that all go away if other people show up? If they're so out of control, how come they're only out of control with these specific people that they're abusing, right? That doesn't add up. That doesn't make sense at all. And actually, to drive that point home, I actually have 2 videos I'm going to show you, very short, but they get at the idea that, oh, and actually, I'm going to ask one more show of hands. Has anyone ever heard that, oh, but he's such a nice guy. Like, how could he possibly, like, there's no way he could have done that to her. He's so nice. He volunteered at the dinner, community dinner, you know, just something like that, right? He's so nice. How is that possible? So those 2 things, you know, a really important thing to know about violence and people who commit sexual assault, people who are abusive in the home, is that often they know how to act that way and convince people that they're okay, right? That they're nice, even that they're great. And so there's kind of 2 faces. One is the face that's shown publicly, and the other is the face where they lose control, but they only lose control with this one person. So that's not real. It's a controlled loss of control. These 2 faces, right? And so I'm going to show you 2 videos that kind of get at that point. The first one is from a Neighbours, Friends and Families. Like, it looks a little bit older, but like, I think it really still gets the point across. And you'll see someone, and I just want you to notice how he treats the different people in this video. Sorry, 1 second. Okay, it's optimized. Let's watch this one.
Would you learn how to dribble? Come on, Kyle! You play like a girl! What have you been teaching him? You're ruining my son! Where you going? I'm so sorry, Lila. Hey, baby. Wait up.
So that's one. And I mean, you can see how apologetic and nice and, you know, even charming he was to the people he bumped into compared to the person that he's allowing himself to treat that way. And then the second video I'm going to show you, it's an elevator video. Excuse me. And in this elevator video, you'll see a similar switch. And that video goes on, you know, the person who gets in the elevator, I think still kind of got a sense, a vibe of what was going on, and then was a supportive person. She left the elevator with the woman. But you can see in both of those examples, there's a very controlled decision that around the person I'm abusing, I'm going to act this way. And with others, it all stops. So if others are watching, it all stops. So that really hopefully kind of just puts to rest that myth that it's about a loss of control and anger. It isn't. It's about gaining power and control over someone by using tactics of abuse. And that's one thing that kind of worries me about when people talk about COVID and how stressful it is, and how, like, yes, rates of gender-based violence, it's more serious because people can't access support, right? It's more difficult to access support and there's more opportunities for abuse. But COVID and isolation is not an excuse for abuse. Like, honestly, I've been isolated at home and I've been stressed. Does that mean that I'm like, oh, now I can abuse someone? No way, right? And so this is kind of, though, the mentality we often have is that, oh, it's because of stress. It's because it isn't, right? It's about gaining power and control. So I could go on and on about that, but I'll move on. I'll just make two last points, and then I'm so excited to hear the other panelists. Talking about gender-based violence in newcomer communities is also tricky because of racism, right? Of racism and this idea that gender-based violence, is something that's only happening in newcomer communities, right? When in fact, we saw those statistics at the beginning, right? In Canada, gender-based violence happens at very regular rates. Murder of women, like, it's a Canadian problem. It happens across the board in all cultures, all racial backgrounds, all ethnicities. But when it comes to talking about newcomers and gender-based violence, all of a sudden it becomes about race, right? So it's really important to remember that gender-based violence can affect anyone, including those who are born in Canada, lived here for many generations, absolutely can be perpetrating gender-based violence. Newcomers face the same rates of gender-based violence as other communities. The only difference is that newcomers may face unique barriers for accessing supports and services. This is a quote from a survivor, a newcomer survivor of gender-based violence, who's saying, I was in a relationship waiting and living in hell because I didn't know that we have all this kind of supports. So access to information about supports, that's why, we started with all these, knowing these resources and the ones in the chat really well is going to go a long way for people who might not be aware of the supports that are here. So yes, so here are some of the, this has already been covered, but I'll just quickly go through some of the unique barriers faced by newcomer survivors of violence. Definitely, for some, there are fears and concerns regarding immigration status and fear of deportation. And remember that thing about the puppet strings, right? An abuser could be using this to keep someone silent, to keep someone under control. So social isolation of newcomers, right? If they're facing language barriers, racism, geographic distance, lack of transportation. Gender-based violence and isolation go hand in hand, right? Abusers often want to keep their people they're abusing isolated. So any kind of social isolation is going to create more barriers. Lack of information about gender-based violence services, laws, legal rights. There's fear of child protective services. If I tell anyone what's going on, they're going to take my kids. Fear of social stigma if they speak up. Economic exclusion, right? Underemployment, lack of recognition of foreign credentials, concerns about racism, stereotyping, and then a lack of culturally sensitive support services. So this is quite a list of barriers, but it's not to say that it's insurmountable. Newcomer women on a daily basis are accessing services, navigating all of these barriers, finding ways to freedom from violence and safety. But it's important to know that these are all at play. So that way, when you're supporting someone, you can be aware of these difficulties that might arise and be a resource. And so gender-based violence and racism, just a little bit more on that barrier, but I think folks are probably already aware of this. There's a belief that gender-based violence is imported by immigrants and refugees, but in reality, it's here in Canada, and it's been here in Canada since, you know, settler colonization started this country. And the second myth related to gender-based violence and racism, there's a horrible anti-Black and racist myth that somehow Black and brown men are more prone to committing gender-based violence. Absolutely not true. It happens across all races, cultures. To be blunt, white men absolutely perpetrate gender-based violence. There's no difference in rates there. And then lastly, there's an Islamophobic belief that Muslim communities are barbaric and, you know, similar to these other myths that have talked about that, you know, somehow gender-based violence belongs to them. They're doing it, no one else, just them, right? And that's not helpful at all, because, I mean, who would want to then share if they're going through something, if people are already looking at you this way, right? So it's really important to be aware of this. And if you're ever supporting a survivor of gender-based violence from racialized newcomer communities, you know, make sure just to say, like, yeah, this happens in all communities, right? Like, this isn't about you, like, or about your culture or anything like that, right? Like, really avoid making any links like that, because that might make someone not trust you, to be honest. And so I don't know if there's a time for, let me just check the chat. How am I doing for time? I think
it would be great if you would wrap up.
Okay.
As well.
Okay. I'll wrap up by saying just two slides quickly, what not to do and what to do. So if someone tells you that they're facing abuse of any kind, one thing you don't want to do is ever blame them for it. You never want to blame them for it. And you might think, oh, I would never blame someone for abuse. But there are ways that we can blame without realizing that we're blaming, okay? One way that we can, these are 6 different statements that might be a hint that we're victim blaming. We might be blaming the person for what they went through, which really can cause a second trauma for them. If first you go through something, now you're being blamed for what you went through. Here are some hints that victim blaming might be happening. Why did you go there? Why did you spend time alone with him? Why did you marry him? Right? It's kind of making it like she did something to cause the abuse, as opposed to thinking about, why is he acting like this? Why doesn't he stop? Right? You notice how it's focusing on her. Well, why did you go there? Why did you wear that? Why were you drinking? All those kinds of questions are blaming. We don't want to ask any questions like that. We also don't want to say, you should have known. Well, you should have known. You should have known that he would end up, you know, being this way during the pandemic. You should have left him before we locked down. You see how it's putting all the blame back onto her shoulders? It's because of her decisions she's being abused. It's putting it all on her instead of where it belongs. All the responsibility belongs on the person who's doing the abuse. And then the last one I'll share from here is, don't you care? Don't you care about your children if you were to leave him? Don't you care what the impact of that would be on them? But actually, the person who's harming the children is the person doing the abuse. So why are we transferring that onto her because she wants to leave? You see that switch, right? That switch always happens, or often happens. And that's what we want to avoid doing. So think very carefully. If someone tells you they're being through abuse, really be careful. What kind of questions am I asking? What am I saying? Instead of asking those questions, and this is the last slide, here are 4 really, really good approaches you can use instead. Make sure that she knows that you believe her, right? Like, I believe you, like, absolutely, right? Because she might have been told, no one's going to believe you if you tell them. So you can kind of counteract that right away. I believe you, right? Remind her it's not her fault. So instead of asking all these questions, why did you go there? What about, no, it's not your fault. That's it. Not your fault. Oh, so why didn't you prevent it? No, it's not your fault. Walk with her, stay connected to her as she makes the different decisions that she wants to make. She takes the lead, you walk beside her, right? You don't push her to do anything. And then connect her with resources like the ones that you're getting in the chat, like the ones I've shared. in a safe way. You wouldn't want the person who's being abusive to know that you're doing that. So you want to find a safe way to communicate with her. And these two websites, Neighbours, Friends and Families.ca, Immigrant and Refugee NFF, which stands for Neighbours, Friends and Families.ca, these both will really guide you through different step-by-step actions you can take to support someone if you think they're living with abuse. So those are two additional resources I think we'll add to our ongoing list in the chat. So I'll end there, and I look forward to the next presenter in the Q&A. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Citra, for highlighting. And I like the way that you started with those resources too, because that's the real action part when we talk about ending the silence. So, you know, like that's the how you end the silence and how important that is. And also the fact that you highlighted so many themes which are so intertwined, from trauma to justice and human rights, how it's that kind of an issue, how it's really at the root cause, it's power and control, and not that the person has the inability to kind of control their anger. And, you know, so all of that. So I appreciate all of what you shared with us. I'm going to move on to Jaspreet now. And I hope we'll have like 10 minutes or so for questions later. I'm sorry, we're running out of time a little bit. So Jaspreet, our last speaker, last but not the least, she received her social science worker diploma with high honors from Sheridan College. As an international student from India, she held multiple roles at her college, including president of Sheridan International Students Association, peer mentor, student leadership and engagement, and international students ambassador. And here in all these positions, she was able to offer various services and support to students. Jaspreet has been recognized with the Newcomer Resilience Award and has contributed as a research assistant to a project called Domestic Violence in Immigrant Communities Case Studies. She believes in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and works towards making a difference in others' lives by providing them with appropriate support and services. Over to you, Jaspreet. Thank you.
Thanks also for the wonderful introduction. And thank you all for joining. Thanks to our presenters as well. I would like to share my presentation would be focused on resources and community supports available to the newcomers, women, who are the victims or survivors of domestic violence. So I would like to start with the activity that's called Which Would You Choose? So I'll be providing with the participants with two scenarios, and you have to choose which one is appropriate. So our first scenario is, so in this case, the husband says, let's dance, it's your family's big day, it's our family's big day. And then second scenario, the husband says, I don't like you dancing at wedding. So I would love to have the responses in the chat if all the participants can just type A or B. Yeah, A for sure. Yeah, for sure. So moving to the next slide, where it explains that in the first scenario, the husband tries to control the behavior of her wife because he doesn't want her to do something that he doesn't like, or he doesn't want her to do something that she likes. So he's trying to control her. So controlling behavior can be in multiple forms, like trying to control how to dress, what to eat, where to go, what to say, and they may stop you doing something that you enjoy. And if you don't follow them, or if you don't agree with them, they may punish you. And just want to remind you all that any kind of abuse is never okay, whether it's physical, emotional, sexual, or financial, it's never been okay. We should always encourage them to say no to abuse. And abuse can be like stalking somebody. If the husband doubts her wife that she might be going somewhere else or meeting somebody else, so they might use a tactics like stalking or keeping track where she's going or putting cameras in the home. So that's also kind of abuse, and it can be isolating or controlling as well. So it's not only the intimate partner that might cause the abuse. The extended family might join the abuse as well. So it happens in all communities, as discussed by other panelists as well. There's no specific community like immigrants, but it happens in all communities. So moving to the next slide, it's the same thing. Which would you choose? So in scenario A, the wife is saying, I'm going to call my sister. And the husband says, tell her I say hi. But the second scenario says, I don't like when you talk to her. So he wants to control her behavior. Yeah, just type in your responses in the chat. Feel free to type in. Yeah, so it would be A. Yeah, thank you. Third one says, if you leave me, so they're separating. That's a case. In this case, they're separating. If you leave me, I'll get you kicked out of Canada. And the second scenario, it says, sometimes loving someone means letting them go. So first, in the first scenario, the husband wants to threaten her that if you leave me, I'm gonna deport you. So this might not let her go because of her immigration status. She might think that her immigrant status is like 100% dependent on her husband. So in this case scenario as well, so B is safe and loving. So B will be more appropriate. And the other one, next case scenario. So first and says, I'm going to somewhere, I'm going to the mall, and the husband starts to like doubt her. That's, as I told earlier, if he doubts her, he's gonna stop. So it's another scenario. It's saying, I'm going to the mall, and then say, have a good time. That's a safe and loving. So this is the difference that we have to recognize. We have to look for these kind of warning signs. They might be little, but they might be very helpful us to recognize, and we can help the women who might be the victim of the abuse. So similar, next case scenario, you called me last night, and the wife says, I'm so sorry, I'm going to do better. So this is healthy behavior. The next case scenario, they're gonna say, oh, things got easier when you were a man. So it's a transphobic abuse. So the motive here is just discuss what the abuse looks like and how the behavior can be different when there is not abuse and when there is abuse. Similarly, next case scenario also focus on that. I just want to respect that time. I know we just have 25 minutes left. I'm gonna skip some slides and move to my next, the blue sky. I'm gonna skip those slides, just you don't have the time right now. Sorry about that. Yeah, so blue sky, that's a wonderful model we have that not only shape the way we support individual experiencing violence, but also it helps us being a compassionate and trauma-informed approach to support individuals and communities to create safer communities. So here B stands for believe her. So whatever happening to her is not right, and we have to believe, we have to trust the victim, because we want to create that trusting relationship so that she may open up and share more about the abuse. We don't blame her, as discussed by Sidra as well. So we don't blame her, and listen to her. So as I told, blaming only destroy that trusting relationship. So they need to be trusted, they need to be believed. So victim needs to be trusted. And understanding her immigration status as well, because as I told as well, that it might depend on the abuser. So if you want to consider, or if you want to help her, just connect with a settlement counselor or settlement agencies. There are a lot of settlement agencies in Peel, all over Toronto in Canada. And next is ease isolation. So this may be the best thing you can do for her, easing isolation, because being a support system to her, being friends, and just taking her to somewhere like a mall, or just accompanying her with appointments, so that she don't feel isolated. And next is support for choices. So we want the best for her. So we don't give opinions, we don't give recommendations, or give suggestions. We just provide them with the resources. So you are acting as a resource, but you are acting as a guide, but you're not telling them that you have to do that, but you are just providing them with the resources that they can take a help and help themselves. Next, gonna say that know about the resources. So as discussed by Sidra as well, that you should be prepared because you are acting as a resource for her. So you should know what factors may impact. So you have to check the eligibility criteria. If you want to connect her with an organization, you're going to check the eligibility criteria. It's going to cost or not, where, how far it is, what's the timing. So all these little things you have to keep in mind. You have to be prepared. And then your voice matters. So you don't want to gossip around her about her. So here the piece of confidentiality comes here. So because she shared her situation with you because she trusts you. So you don't want to just destroy that relationship. So you don't need to gossip about her. You have to talk to settlement agencies or organization because you need to help, right? But you don't need to gossip around the whole world. Yeah. So next resource I'm gonna share with you is Sync It. So see it, name it, check it. So if you're thinking of a woman who is living with abuse, so how are you gonna help her? So see it. So you don't ignore the signs. You don't say, oh, that's usual, or that might not be the domestic violence signs. It's just the regular wounds or anything. If you have the gut feeling that something is wrong, then there's something going on. So you should acknowledge those warning signs and high risk signs as well. It might not be physical, it might be emotional, and if you notice in the behavior, if she is not if there is a change in the behavior, she's not behaving normal as usual, so you have to be there for her. Then name it. So if it feels appropriate and you're in safe and private place and no one can overhear or monitor your conversation, then you have to talk to the women. You should talk to the women and you have to tell her, see, I saw this and this and I care for you. I'm here for you to support. How can I help? Instead of telling her, you should do this, you should call 911. No, we just tell them the resources again. And if you don't feel safe or if you not have that relationship with the women, you should talk to somebody you trust. But as I told, don't gossip around, like talk to some counselor or somebody who has actual trusting relationship with you. Or if there is nobody, just name it to yourself. Just tell that there's something going on, what might be there. Then check it. So there's something going wrong and you name it, and now's the time to find the resources for her. There's several agencies, several shelters, and you have to help her developing a safety planning. So you have to stay connected to her and find a way of keep speaking with her privately. You don't want the abuser to know that you're talking about this thing. So for example, just telling that we're going to the mall, but you're connecting with her with a organization that helps the women living with the abuse. So that might be one case. Moving to next slide. So if there is somebody who is living with abuse in your community, what should you do? So you're gonna speak to her one-on-one, and you make sure that you share tasks, maximize tasks, support, like accompanying her to an appointment or just go to grocery shopping with her. So she spends the time with you and she feels supported, and she feels she has some friends or networks. So, and once she feels that, she's gonna open up and tell more about what's going on. And you have to advocate for her as well, because some cases she might not be that, because she might be that mentally upset, she might be drained so well that she can't voice, or she can't raise voice for herself. So you should be there to advocate for her. And again, just respect that confidentiality. And if the abuse is happening in the faith community, then be aware, because the abuser might have a strong relationship with the faith community. Yeah, here in Canada, it's not like that, but in back home, we know that the abuser has some strong relationship with the police or the faith group. So the women might have those experiences back home. So we need to consider that as well. So if like, for example, she went to for a complaint against the abuser, but he had those relationships, those networks with the faith community or the police. So how she gonna get impacted, right? Going to be negative for her. So we have to keep in mind those social location things. I'm going to move to the next slide. Feeling hesitation or concern, like you're going to support a woman and you're feeling nervous that should I support what, like I'm alone. How can I do that? I'm not trained to do that. Like some things that comes to your mind. So we just kind of tell you that you are not alone. If you need support, just look for support for yourself. If there is any other community who is doing the work regarding this, you should connect with them. And again, this is not a private matter. It's a community issue. Whole community is impacted by the violence and takes a community to respond to it. So it's not personal, it's a community issue. And there are resources available, the community resources for the person who is doing the abuse as well. It's not like for the victim, it's for the abuser as well. So many grassroots organizations, many campaigns are going on, many advocacy groups that they're always there to support. And there are many resources shared by Modgen and Sidra about this, the crisis line. There are great resources available 24/7. Yeah, so I'm gonna quickly, respecting time, just share with you these 3 resources. So graphic novel, it's like a knowledge, it's like a knowledge resource. It's not for the for just referring to the victim, but for your own knowledge. So what can be done and how the violence is impacting. So the graphic novel is a very interactive resource, and I have personally read it. And it's going to generate those conversations among the community. Both resources are created with immigrant and refugee women who experience gender-based violence. And they're available in various languages as well. And the future without gender-based violence is also a great resource. And the second one as well, the booklet. For the first one, there's a great stories. They're very, very good and very relatable to what we are talking today. I'm just gonna move to next slide. And these are resources that you already Sidra and Modgen shared in their slides. So I'm not gonna spend much time on that. So crisis situation, what you're gonna contact the Assaulted Women's Helpline. And if you're gonna find a shelter, there various shelter, it's 211 transitional housing page at Sidra shared as well. And victim support line, victim services appeal, and you can contact the Canadian Resource Center of Victims of Crime. And for legal aid support, you can always contact Legal Aid Ontario. They're gonna provide you free 2-hour consultation by a lawyer. It's free, it's completely free. It's a great resource. And if there is not appropriate languages, there are always interpreters available in 70 languages, 24/7, to provide that support. And there's things to consider when supporting domestic violence survivors. So when helping immigrant women who are dealing with domestic violence, we must keep in mind their previous experiences when seeking support prior to them immigrating to Canada. So as this point I already discussed in my past slide about the police and the faith community. So we have to keep in mind while supporting them. So they might not be able to speak up for themselves. So we should be there to advocate for her. So here is where advocacy piece comes. And so there's a quick slide about if some women see they're facing abuse in COVID-19, how are they gonna tell? Because the abuser is with them in the home, so they're gonna. So this is a sign, so they can palm to the camera and tuck their thumb, grab the thumb. This is a sign they can use to tell their support system, tell other people that they are living with the abuse during COVID-19. So there is another campaign called No Excuse for Abuse. And it's a 4 steps to help support individuals who are living with abuse during the COVID-19 pandemic. So you have to learn abuse and COVID-19. So what is abuse and how COVID-19 is making it worse? And second is be aware of abuse and COVID-19. Find out how to offer support. So that's what you have to research on there. You have to be the resource. Then share when you're presenting. So this is kind of promoting the awareness. So when you're sharing your when you're on the Zoom, you can just use this background or on social media to promote the awareness. And there's a great resource called My Plan Canada. And this is the app you can download on your phone. And this tool will help you create a safety planning based on what your needs are. So when you download it, My Plan Canada, you just kind of select Canada as your country. Then you have to create a PIN code. So you make sure that's unique and it's not common. And then you're going to select your situation according to your specific needs. And while you're doing some they're going to create some activities, and depending on that, it helps you to make a safety plan. And it's very safe. So when abuser wants to see your see the phone and say, which app is this? So you just enter 0000. That's a random PIN generated. It's going to take you a different website. It doesn't going to take you to your safety plan. So it's very safe to use. So yeah, that's it for now. I'm just gonna do a Kahoot activity if there's it's like take a 4 or 5 minutes.
We have like 10 minutes for the session, so it may be a good idea to maybe, if you do you mind just putting the link on the chat, then people can test it out themselves. That way we get a few extra minutes for any questions. And if you don't mind, I apologize. I've really squeezed you for time. My apologies.
Here is the link for Kahoot.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's amazing.
No problem.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jaspreet. Amazing. And I love the way you started with some of those examples to make it kind of real, because what the earlier speakers were talking about, how like sometimes all evidence seems to point to the contrary. Oh, he's really a nice guy and must be just like a bad mood today or something like that. Also, I think 2 other things happen that the identity, often the woman's identity is kind of shaped by this relationship. So how do you kind of get out of that? And the relationship, intimate relationships are often supposed to be relationships of love and care. And so it's hard to kind of put your finger on it. And you say, you have to swim against the tide. And you say, so like, is this really happening? You begin to question yourself. So yeah, thank you for all your examples and your presentation. So I don't see any questions in the chat yet. If anybody would like to put some questions, I do have a couple of thoughts that would be great if the panelists
Question here, I think from Zahir.
Oh, okay.
At the beginning of the presentation.
Okay.
I'm just looking at it right now. Give me 1 second.
Yeah, there's so much gone in between, so maybe I missed that.
But I can read it, and then the
yes,
the
please.
speaker if they want to answer the question.
Please go ahead.
The question says, what is the level of support for gender-based violence and mental health for recent newcomers, especially those who are vulnerable, considering that they need some sort of transitional support to bridge them to mainstream services? So if any of the speakers want to answer the question.
And if I just may add one small question just to that, because it's very similar. Also, if you can speak a little bit to any supports, because it's a journey, even when the woman leaves the relationship, sometimes it's the fear of leaving because you don't know what's going to happen after. And then the journey is really hard because oftentimes I've noticed the community members also don't really support, because they may find, there's kind of stigma around that, and all those things are still there. So how can women be supported after also? If you can just speak a little bit to that as well in your resources.
Yeah, I copied the question in the chat, so it's the last message. Everybody can see it, and we'll turn it to the speakers if they want to answer this question.
Yes, thank you.
Sorry, I could, is Mojan. I wonder if I should come on the camera again.
Yes, please do.
Sure, hi. May I address the question in terms of after leaving, what kind of support exists there and how to seek the support? The mental health support is very limited, so that's really challenging. There's often very long waiting lists to get mental health. From what I've heard and experienced, the hotline, the domestic violence hotline, is the best option that could be sought for immediate sort of mental health support. There's a team of wonderful counselors and volunteers that work on the line. So the Women's Helpline is a life survivor for a lot of, lifesaver, I should say, for a lot of immediate need of attention. If you're employed, through your employment, you may have access to certain 10-session of counseling session through your employee insurance services. So it's good to actually look at the policy or get in touch with your HR and find out exactly what you're entitled to. But in terms of having a long-term ongoing support, which many women that are coming out of domestic violence will need, as I mentioned in my presentation, often it takes 7 to 10 times efforts of leaving, 7 to 10 years of remaining in domestic violence situation for women to finally reach the decision or realization that this is never going to get fixed or better, or I'm never going to fix it, after seeking every form of, especially in marriage, after seeking every form of possible counseling and services to assist and keep the family together. One generally ends up reaching a point that you have to leave, and the solution to domestic violence is leaving. That's the only solution for it. Unfortunately, one side of it is death, and the other side of it, you actually leaving. It usually, generally, it ends, I should also highlight, is a really tough thing to say, is a really tough thing to face, is a really tough reality to accept. But domestic violence always progressively increases to something that becomes completely unmanageable in many cases for many women, and the evidence shows that. And women end up leaving within this cycle or progression at different stages of it. The sooner you leave, the better, the easier the recovery process for you and your child and your loved one is, or the suffering is less, the damage is less, it takes less of a time for recovery, but the support is very limited. A lot of community services, if you end up domestic violence community services, just a Google search would allow you to find out which services. Obviously, pandemic has impacted what services are available, but Barbara Schleifer, for example, ends up having drop-in clinics. which means that on certain days of the week for an hour, they end up having group counseling sessions. But those group counseling sessions never give an opportunity for individuals to be able to, they're not the kind of setting that you would go and discuss your personal needs. It's more of a setting that you end up going to learn better tools to recover and deal with some of the mental health, emotional, and responsive sort of tools that you need to be able to deal with domestic violence or manage the aftershock and after effects of domestic violence. So services, definitely we need a lot of advocacy towards it. There's lack of services for it, considering that there's growing number of domestic violence. I'm going to stop there and let other colleagues to come in.
Yeah, Sidra, if you'd like to respond. And there's this other question as well. What sort of support can undocumented and unemployed people receive when considering leaving GBV relationships?
Regarding the mental health and gender-based violence services, I put a link in the chat to Women's Health and Women's Hands, which is a really great organization in Toronto that works with women, racialized women. There are a lot of so there's a link there for mental health services. They have one-on-one counseling, they have group counseling, they have different programming. But when thinking about gender-based violence and mental health in supports, one way to look at it is through the social determinants of health. So, supporting someone's mental health and healing from gender-based violence, it looks like connecting them to resources, specialized resources that deal with gender-based violence, right? Anti-violence services, counseling services, the Assaulted Women's Helpline. But it also looks like meeting other needs, right? Because all of these different determinants of health can impact our mental health, right? Access to food, shelter, community connections, right? Maybe there's a drop-in group for women, right? Maybe there's, a cooking class, arts-based class that someone wants to connect with. A lot of settlement organizations and anti-violence services provide these kind of informal programming and supports that are great spaces to help with mental health, because it starts, building relationships with other people, developing friendships, focusing on, I remember there's a woman I was talking to who's a survivor who did an employment program while being in a situation of abuse. And in the employment program, it was all about her strengths. It was all about focusing on building what she's good at. And that experience of being there and connected with that service is what helped her challenge a lot of those ideas that she kind of almost been brainwashed with about herself through the violence. And so, yes, like services like Women's Health and Women's Hand, Women's College Hospital has a trauma program that's really great. They do have a waiting list, but it's a great one to be aware of. Connecting through the Assaulted Women's Helpline with counseling services, but also community programs, social connections, food, friendship. Those are really big things for mental health as well. And I want people to leave feeling like there is a lot that you can do. Yes, there are waiting lists, but that doesn't mean, there's nothing we can do. And I just want to say, just in case, there's any misunderstanding, even if someone is in a violent situation that lasted one day, right, it could still have a very long-term impact. So it isn't just about the length of the time that someone's involved in something that will determine how long-term the impact is.
I would just like to add to Sidra's point. I think we should also help in development, building the informal support system, apart from doing the formal one. So also build up on the families and friends, connecting her to them, and that she can feel supported, because it's her immediate connections that she's able to share those information or share that's what's going with her is wrong. So that's the the trusting relationship she already has developed. So we have to focus on connecting her to her informal supports.
Yeah, Yeah, thanks. That's a great point. Since there's no question on the chat, I have a burning one of mine, my own, just for a very brief moment. Since we've been talking so much about community members being able to support, don't you think there is need for resources and ways in which we can support community members to learn how to support? Because the bystander accountability and the bystander role is so critical. This came up even in our last panel at the end, where it's really the informal supports that the women have no choice but to go to, and those are the supports that have no funding. So if anybody has any thought to weigh in on that, Sidra, I think I see you nodding your head vigorously. Do you want to say something?
I just completely agree with what you just said, that community-based grassroots support and networks and community-led solutions are often what women rely on. And yeah, it would be great if those could be recognized as services and be funded and get more funding. I completely agree. But did you have a question in that, or was it more?
No, my question really was, are there any resources for community members, even in terms of how I think there should be, if there could be training programs where we can have community-led supports, and then they can become part of a more formal structure if there are no ways to fund informal structures.
Neighbors, Friends, and Families is really, Neera posted these 2 resources. I'll just post them again. They have trainings or information and peer champions in the community that are doing exactly what you're saying. Did I interrupt someone? Was someone about to say the same thing?
I think Neera wanted to say something. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, go for it. Here.
Yeah, hi everybody. So yes, to what Sidra was mentioning, the community support and community programs are key and essential to support people who experience gender-based violence. And especially because there was a question there about a status, and especially because this country sadly doesn't recognize the rights of women without a status who experience gender-based violence. There's limited resources and support for them that they can actually access. Yes, women who experience gender-based violence, and yes, and they have non-status. Yes, they can call the police. Yes, they can go to a shelter. Yes, they can receive all those services that a shelter or transitional house will provide to them. But after that, it's very, very limited. They don't have access to legal aid most of the time, or it's very limited. They can't apply to housing. Acquiring legal status in Canada is very difficult, lengthy, and it's very expensive. If they have kids and the father of the kids happen to be Canadian, there's big chances that the kids are going to be taken away from her because she doesn't have a status, and not having a status means that she can't provide for those kids. Sadly, that's a reality here in Canada. So those government-funded programs and services and community rally and the grassroots organizations are key to provide services and support those women who have no status. And actually, honestly, community programs, grassroots organizations, and advocacy groups are amazing to all women who are experiencing violence.
Thank you. Thanks, Neera. Did anybody?
Sorry, if I may comment as well. Using individuals like survivors of domestic violence who are interested and passionate. You cannot not be passionate about domestic violence once you've experienced it. It's such a empowering, enlightening experience to go through. The woman that I've come across, once you end up going through the process of recovery, quite a lot want to be involved in advocacy towards protecting other female and families from domestic violence. But yet there isn't within nonprofit sector even and community-based organization a place for them to be able to do to talk about their experiences, to be able to advocate for their own communities, for friends, people in general. So coming up with programs that enables, as Alka very kindly and Sidra ended up mentioning as well, that involves individuals, that have survivors of domestic violence that are interested to talk about personal experiences, to be able to not necessarily, the dark side of personal experiences, but the educational aspects of that experience. It's almost one of those things that is really hard to grasp your head around it unless you have completely understood and experienced it personally, because it just creeps on you in a way that you could have never imagined it would.
If I can elaborate on that. So at OCASI, we have a project. It's a 5-year project on building the leadership capacity of non-status refugee and immigrant women who have experienced gender-based violence. And it's a project that we have been crafting for the last 3 years, being very careful on how do we let women, well, it's a project that it's led by women who have experienced gender-based violence. We kind of reverse things a little bit. So we let the women who have experienced violence to lead us on how we're going to develop this blueprint. I think any project like that needs to be very mindful of how women participate in that project, how much resources they provide to the project, and how they're compensated. Sometimes I fear that sometimes women, they tend to overcompensate because they receive services and they are free of abuse now. They try to sometimes overcompensate the help that they receive, and they work themselves and they burn out, right? There's a balance that we always need to keep in mind, that when women who have experienced violence try to contribute again, yes, they have the right, the space need to be there, but it has to be very mindful about their own needs as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a great point. And I think the whole idea that on the one hand, we want to end the silence, but we know there is the silence, and silence means secrecy. And what you really need to be able to end that silence is for things to come out into the open, unless there is some kind of and that there are barriers to that itself. The barriers to silence also, I think, is really critical. I think Surabhi has a last question, so I'm going to give that to her and then we will end. So has there been any advocacy to provide immigration status to victims of domestic violence? Thanks, Surabhi, for that. Anybody wants to take a quick stab at that?
I think there's always groups who are helping women to acquire their legal status. Locally, there's the Barbara Schleifer Clinic that works with women without status. It's a choice, it's an option for women to try to, come out of their, to present themselves as non-status and trying to apply for a status, because chances are that they're gonna get deported. It's extremely expensive, both in terms of money and in terms of emotional cost. So I think it's a choice, and there's no funding for agencies to support women who have no status, right? So all that money comes from private donors, grants, fundraising, but actually it's very, very limited. Even organizations and community centers that provide services for women, they are funded by the clients they see. So they're funded by numbers, and those numbers need to have some kind of legal status in Canada, right? So advocacy, grassroots are great opportunities and great organizations that are helping women, but it's very expensive.
Okay, thank you. I don't think that we can take this last one because we're really out of time. Sorry about that, Surabhi. So I just want to...
It was just a comment, but thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so thank you so much for our generous speakers for bringing this wealth of information and really the resources that you talked about, including kind of raising such really important and complex issues around this whole topic. I hope that we are not feeling overwhelmed. If we are feeling overwhelmed by the resources, that's a good thing, because then that way we can all support anybody who may be in need of our support. So, and thank you so much to all the participants for staying with us till like on a Friday evening, right till this late hour and all of that. So we really appreciate that. And we look forward to seeing you again for the third session. And please, anybody who has not completed the feedback survey, I'm sure many of you haven't, we will email it to you and then you can get back to us on that. Thank you so very much. Have a good evening, everyone.